Nestled in the vast expanse of the South Pacific Ocean, Norfolk Island stands as a unique gem. But what sets this remote paradise apart is its extraordinary legacy, a legacy deeply intertwined with the infamous Bounty Mutiny. Today, Norfolk Island boasts more descendants of the mutineers than even Pitcairn itself, a fact shrouded in a remarkable tale of human migration. In 1856, as Pitcairn Island faced overcrowding, its inhabitants were relocated to Norfolk Island, forever changing the island's destiny. The blend of Polynesian and European heritage has given rise to a distinctive society marked by neighborliness, self-help, and a thriving barter system. But amidst the stunning landscapes and warm community spirit lies a darker past. Norfolk Island has been the site of not one, but two penal colonies, earning it the ominous nickname Hell in the Pacific. Here, the British would send their most undesirables to be penalized in a most dreaded way, and dying on this god-forsaken island. It had several prison uprisings, and when guilty were told that they were to be hanged, they fell on their knees, thanking God that their time finally was up. This is History with Magnus. But before we begin, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel a lot, and blah blah blah. Early settlement. Archaeological evidence shows that the island was inhabited by Polynesian seafarers between the 13th and 15th centuries. It is still unknown why this settlement ended, but it could be because of its remote location. The island's European history began when Captain James Cook visited in 1774 during his second voyage to the South Pacific, and the island was settled by the British in March 1788. It was chosen for a settlement because Captain Cook had identified the towering Norfolk Island pines as being useful for ships' masts and the local flax as good for sails, something that later will prove to be wrong. When the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay, it fell to Lieutenant Philip Gridley King to select the handful of men and women convicts who were to colonize Norfolk Island. 6 women and 9 male convicts, and 8 free men were selected for the task. These colonists sailed the 1,000-mile journey and spent the next 5 days sailing around the coast in search of a place to land. Eventually, at a spot they called Sydney Bay, they found a passage through the reef wide enough to allow larger ships to approach. During the first year of the settlement, more convicts and soldiers were sent to the island from New South Wales. A second village was started at Ball Bay, named after the captain of HMS Supply. Commandant King was in charge of the new colony and wasted no time in selecting a mistress, an ex-dressmaker named Anne Inette, who'd been convicted for stealing clothes. 2 other couples also formed, and it wasn't long before all 3 ladies were pregnant. On the 8th of January, 1789, Anne Inette gave birth to the settlement's first child, who was given the name Norfolk. Meanwhile, 1,000 leagues away, the HMS Bounty was anchored in Matavai Bay in Tahiti. Under the command of William Bligh, the Bounty was on a mission to collect breadfruit plants and transport them to the West Indies. Bligh was seen by many as a great captain, astronomer, navigator, scientist, and cartographer. However, his crew found him spiteful and foul-tempered. Contrary to popular belief, Bligh was not a harsh man by the standards of the day. In a time when sentences of lashes were common, he rarely ordered these on the way down to Tahiti, but this increased as the Bounty was leaving the island after the men had been in paradise for 5 months. His flaw was poor people skills, and he treated his subordinates as fools, quick to criticize and find fault, and impossible to please. Tired of this, along with missing their Tahitian wives, some whom were pregnant, a mutiny erupted. Led by Fletcher Christian, a master's mate on the ship, the mutineers took control of the Bounty, casting Bligh and 18 loyalists adrift in a small open boat. The mutineers eventually settled on Pitcairn Island, a tiny, uninhabited speck in the South Pacific, which had been wrongly charted on all British maps, and started a new life on this remote isle. But it didn't take long before a civil war on the island killed all the men, except for 2 of the mutineers. Check out my video for more on that. Back on Norfolk Island, the population had swollen to 150, and more prisoner colonists were on the way. Following a shipwreck, the island suddenly had hundreds of new mouths to feed and began to face starvation. The starving islanders fed on migrating birds, which appeared unexpectedly, but life on the island was becoming harder. With so many new convicts to control, the commandants turned to the whip. The frequent lashes took a toll on colony morale, and hungry men began to steal. This led to more punishment, and eventually the authorities decided to abort the colony because of this. In February 1814, the island was abandoned, and the prisoners there were transported to Tasmania. Before they left, the buildings were burned or razed. A dozen dogs were left on the island to kill the remaining cattle and pigs, the idea being to leave nothing of value behind. In 1825, it was decided that Norfolk Island would be the site of another colony. This second colony, however, was intended to be a great prison to house prisoners with no hope of rehabilitation. Sir Thomas Brisbane later wrote, "I could wish it to be understood that the felon who is sent there is forever excluded from hope of return. It was to be a place of the severest punishment short of death." By 1843, the population exceeded 2,000 souls, and any attempts at prison reform were defeated by distant authorities. They wanted a place of punishment, without mercy, and succeeded. The prisoners called the island Hell in the Pacific. Conditions became more and more hellish under the command of Commandant John Price, who ruled by terror, informers, and the lash. Such a place is destined to see rebellion, and many occurred. Following one uprising, a priest wrote of the desperation. Those rebels who were spared would weep bitterly that they must live. Those condemned to die fell to their knees and thanked God that they would be delivered from this horrid place, making many observers and clergy note that he was out of control and guilty of grave cruelty and abuse of power. Back on Pitcairn, the settlers were finding their tiny island unable to support them. They had around 200 mouths to feed and only 88 acres of flatland on which to farm. In 1855, the elders wrote to Queen Victoria begging for help, and they were offered Norfolk Island as a new home. In 1856, on the 3rd of May, the entire community of 194 people sailed for Norfolk Island. They were thrilled with their new home. The massive stone buildings looked like castles to them. Yes, this looked like a castle to them, not a prison. The island was full of new sights, because the colonists had never seen cattle or horses that had been left on the island, nor the exotic fruits and vegetables that were there. The Pitcairners occupied many of the buildings remaining from the penal settlements, and gradually established their traditional farming and whaling industries on the island. These Pitcairn Islanders brought with them a rich heritage, including their own unique blend of English and Tahitian culture, language, and traditions. This infusion of Pitcairn culture into Norfolk Island life would have a lasting impact. Although some families decided to return to Pitcairn in 1858 and 1863, the island's population continued to slowly grow as the island accepted settlers, often arriving with whaling fleets. And knowing the dark happenings that unfolded later on Pitcairn, those who stayed on Norfolk had the better deal. For more on that, check out my video, The History of Pitcairn Island, after you finish with this. In 1867, the island was now turned into a self-governing territory, allowing its residents more control over their own affairs. The strong sense of community and family ties that the Pitcairn Islanders brought with them also shaped the island's social fabric. Their influence can still be seen in the close-knit community bonds and communal traditions that remain integral to Norfolk Island culture. One of the most defining aspects of Norfolk Island's culture is the Norfolk language. Islanders speak both English and a Creole language known as Norfolk, a blend of 18th century English and Tahitian, based on Pitcairn. The Norfolk language is decreasing in popularity as more tourists visit the island, and more young people leave for work and education in New Zealand and Australia. However, efforts are being made to keep it alive via dictionaries and the renaming of some tourist attractions to their Norfolk equivalents. In 2004, An act of the Norfolk Island Assembly made Norfolk a co-official language of the island. Music and dance play a vital role in Norfolk Island's culture. Traditional songs and dances have been passed down through generations with influences from Polynesian and European traditions. This led to an awkward situation in the 2000s when Pitcairn Islanders came to visit them. The Pitcairners follows a strict interpretation of Christianity after their conversion in the late 1800s, something that forbids things like dancing. When the Norfolk Islanders started dancing out of joy, the Pitcairners watched them in almost disbelief. Every year on June 8th, Norfolk Islanders commemorate Bounty Day, marking the arrival of the Islanders to Pitcairn in 1790. The celebrations include traditional music, dance with locals and visitors joining in on the festivities. The tight-knit community on Norfolk Island fosters a strong sense of belonging and togetherness. The island's unique phone book is a good example. There they have the names of residents with their phone numbers. This is a common practice everywhere. Norfolk Island has something different. It has a phone book with the nicknames of people. In 1979, Norfolk Island was granted limited self-government by Australia, under which the island elected a government that ran most of the island's affairs. However, after the credit crunch, the island has run into trouble. Financial problems and a reduction in tourism led to Norfolk Island's administration appealing to the Australian federal government for assistance in 2010. In March 2015, the Australian government announced comprehensive reforms for Norfolk Island, and the Norfolk Island Legislative Assembly was abolished, with the territory becoming run by an administrator and an advisory council against the islanders' wishes. From that date, most Australian Commonwealth laws were extended to the island. This means that taxation, social security, immigration, customs, and health arrangements apply on the same basis as in mainland Australia. There is opposition to the reforms, led by Norfolk Island People for Democracy, an association appealing to the United Nations to include the island on its list of non-self-governing territories.
Residents of Norfolk Island are warning they may lose their unique culture if self-rule isn't returned to them by Australia. It's now been 6 years since their government was abolished by Canberra due to financial troubles, and this week a public inquiry began into the recent suspension of the island's regional council. Residents have written to the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, requesting autonomy as appeals continue for the United Nations and Human Rights Council to intervene.
So, unless something is done soon, the future of Norfolk Island doesn't seem too bright. I hope you found this presentation interesting, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and please check out my other videos on this theme to see if there are others you find interesting. And I hope to see you in the next one.